Everyone, welcome back to our lecture on phonological change. Having now seen the case study, our first case study involving the English lateral approximants in the history of Old English, we can draw some conclusions or make generalizations about what the normal course of a historical sound change can look like. So we presume here that this sort of historical sound change of the type represented with the Old English laterals, begins as an optional, unconditioned phonological rule for at least some members of the speech community. So originally, we might imagine there could have been some social conditions. Some speakers applied the lateral voicing rule, and some speakers did not. But what happens is that over time, for whatever reason, we won't concern ourselves for the moment here for the reasons why this happens, the frequency with which that rule applies increases over the generations to the point where the rule becomes obligatory or quasi-obligatory. For instance, for some speakers of North American English, although I've described the tapping rule in North American English as an optional rule, for some speakers it is already basically obligatory in most contexts where the structural description of the rule is met. And once speakers believe that these unconditioned phonological rules, remember we call rules like lateral voicing unconditioned because they don't have a environment that specifies where the rule should be applied. When these rules become obligatory, then the following steps will occur. Restructuring of the underlying representations involving the affected sound will occur, and the rule itself will be lost as well. It's precisely what we described for Old English. Once speakers believed that all of the instances where earlier there was an underlying voiceless lateral approximant were always being pronounced with a voiced lateral approximant, they had no reason to believe that the underlying representations of these words, like loaf, loud, lid, ladder, contained any sound other than a voiced coronal lateral approximant. And at that point, the phoneme sh is gone from the language, and the rule of lateral voicing no longer needs to be acquired either. So the underlying representations, the lexemes, are affected. In this case, the phoneme itself was affected, and the optional rule that was present in the grammar would be lost as well. Let's consider one other case of essentially the same set of phenomena from a completely different language, in this case, Korean, and coming from not from such a long time ago, I wanted to say. So the English sound changes that we just discussed occurred about perhaps a millennium ago, 1,000 years ago. Only about 100 years ago, Korean, on the other hand, had two vowel phonemes, two mid-vowel phonemes, a tense A and a lax E. So we can find some minimal pairs, for instance, K, crab, and Ke, dog, Pe, hem, versus Pe, stomach. And in the dialect of Seoul, we can assume that just as we described for the English laterals, a new optional rule arose, which stated that the tense mid-vowel A could be realized as the lax vowel E, and for some speakers even lower, perhaps A, maybe somewhere in between E and A, but we won't worry about that distinction for the moment. So once, just as we can imagine for the English case, at some point, what happens is that this rule of A to E can describe a similar course of events in terms of rule optionality, say early on. It can, in one generation of speakers, it applies itself half the time. In a later generation, it becomes very likely to apply, such that then in the third generation, it's obligatory, essentially interpreted as an obligatory rule, leading to the phenomenon of restructuring and rule loss that we've described. So these lexical items then become homophonous. They then become pronounced the same way. So what would this generation, if the word for crab is being pronounced as 100% ke, or almost always pronounced as ke, and the word for hemp is almost always pronounced as pe, what should the underlying representation for those words be? Again, if the speaker is not encountering any variation in the pronunciation of these words, or so little variation that the speaker doesn't believe the data, perhaps, then they have no reason to believe that the underlying representation would be anything other than the surface forms that they are encountering. So the words for crab and hemp become underlying ke and pe, just like in the earlier stage of the language, the words for dog and stomach had the underlying representations ke and pe already. So if this happens systematically with all instances of the tense vowel he, what would have happened to this phoneme a? We should expect, just like we saw with the English voiceless lateral approximant, that the phoneme a will disappear from the language. So we can represent the phoneme inventory in the earlier stage as having two phonemes, a and e, when this rule of optional, let's call it, let's actually say this, in the first stage of the language, the two phonemes had completely distinct allophonic distributions. They each only had one allophone. Then, so let's call this stage 1. At a later stage, the optional mid-vowel laxing rule, let's call this rule A, laxing rule, comes to apply, and this will then change the phonemic inventory such that it would be better if I could add an arrow here. Let's see if I can find a nice arrow symbol that I can add to my drawing here. Yes, that would be perfect, this arrow. There we go. Now, the tense vowel a can also have the allophone e as well. But once the speakers believe that they are no longer really hearing any instances of a, and they restructure the underlying representations, then the phoneme inventory suddenly just consists of the sound e alone. And this rule will be lost. So the alaxing rule is lost altogether. So in effect, when all of the underlying representations of the older generation of speakers are updated, so to say, then the phoneme a will be lost, or we can say it was merged with e as a phoneme e. So here's the earlier phoneme inventory, and the later phoneme inventory looks as follows, with just a single phoneme having this single allophone. So just as in Old English, the same set of events has come to pass. So there was a phonological rule that led to restructuring of underlying representations, but then is lost from the synchronic grammar of the speakers. And this is because essentially rules that lack a conditioning environment, rules like lateral voicing in Old English or alaxing in Seoul Korean about 100 years ago, must be optional rules. Without the optionality condition or an environment that says where the rule can be applied, the speaker can't acquire the rule at all, or has no reason to posit or to assume that that phonological rule existed. And thus, if the underlying representations come to be restructured, those optional rules become useless because speakers can't see into the brains of other speakers. They can only hear what other speakers are saying. And if we state both these events in Old English and Korean as sound changes, historical events, then we can describe early Old English voiceless la as becoming later Old English la, and Seoul Korean approximately a century ago, having the tense vowel e, becoming the lax vowel e in present day Seoul Korean. Okay, now that we've seen two instances of this sequence of events of optional rule leading to later increased rule application, and then restructuring of underlying representations, which then brings with it phonemic loss or merger, as we want to call it, as well as loss of the optional rule. Now that we have seen two instances of this diachronic sequence of events, this sequence of events over time, we can move on when we return in the next video to some other patterns of restructuring and seeing how rules can change in further ways.